Have you ever wondered what secrets might be hidden in your own backyard? What if the ground beneath your feet holds horrors that have been waiting decades to be discovered? What if the water you drink has been touched by something or someone that was never meant to be found? Before we begin today's disturbing tale, I want to ask where you're watching from. Drop a comment below letting me know your location. And please subscribe to help this channel continue sharing these hidden stories that others are afraid to tell. The morning of June 17th, 2023 began like any other in the small town of Millfield, Kentucky. The summer heat had already settled heavily across the rolling hills and dense forests that surrounded the former mining community. The population had dwindled to just under 1,000 residents, most of whom were descendants of the coal miners who had established the town in the late 1800s. Among these residents was 34-year-old Lucas Whitaker, a history professor at Eastern Kentucky University who had recently inherited his grandmother's property, a sprawling 6-acre homestead that had been in his family for generations. The Victorian farmhouse, built in 1890, stood weathered but proud on a gentle hill overlooking a creek that wound through the property like a silver ribbon. Lucas had spent his childhood summers at the farmhouse, but it had been nearly 15 years since his last visit. His grandmother, Eliza Whitaker, had passed away at the age of 96, leaving the property to her only surviving grandson. Lucas had initially planned to sell the place, but something had drawn him back. A sense of obligation, perhaps, or a deeper connection to his family's roots that he couldn't quite explain. The property had fallen into disrepair over the years. The once white clapboard siding had faded to a dull grey, the wraparound porch sagged in places, and the ancient oak tree in the front yard had begun to encroach on the roof. But it was the well, the old stone well that stood approximately 50 yards behind the house, that most concerned Lucas. "I always told the children to stay away from that well," his grandmother had written in her journal, which Lucas had found among her belongings. "Some things are better left undisturbed." Lucas had dismissed her warning as the superstition of an elderly woman. His plan was to renovate the property, perhaps turn it into a bed and breakfast or a retreat for writers. The well would need to be properly sealed, of course, for safety reasons. And so, on that fateful June morning, Lucas contacted a local contractor, Raymond Sloan, to assess the well and provide an estimate for sealing it properly. "I've been doing this kind of work for 30 years, Raymond told Lucas as they walked across the overgrown yard toward the well. "Seen all kinds of old structures, but there's something about the wells from that era. They built them to last." The well itself was approximately 4 feet in diameter, constructed of hand-cut limestone blocks that had been meticulously fitted together without mortar. A rotting wooden cover, long since collapsed inward, partially obscured the opening. Surrounding the well was a low stone wall, also made of limestone, that rose about 2 feet from the ground. "Let me take a look," Raymond said, producing a powerful flashlight from his tool belt. He carefully approached the well, testing the stability of the surrounding stone wall before leaning slightly over the edge. The beam of his flashlight disappeared into the darkness below. "Can you see the water?" Lucas asked, keeping a respectful distance. Raymond didn't answer immediately. His body tensed, and he adjusted the angle of the flashlight. "Mr. Whitaker," he said finally, his voice strangely flat, "you might want to call the sheriff." What Raymond Sloan had seen in the beam of his flashlight would forever change the quiet town of Millfield. Approximately 30 feet below, partially submerged in the dark water, were what appeared to be 2 human figures. They were intertwined, their long hair floating around them like dark halos, their pale skin almost luminescent in the flashlight's beam. Sheriff Daniel Holbrook arrived 45 minutes later, along with 2 deputies and the county medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Bennett. The property was quickly cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape, and additional lighting was brought in as they prepared to investigate the well. "We need to document everything before we attempt removal," Sheriff Holbrook instructed. Doctor Bennett, what's your initial assessment? The medical examiner, a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a severe bun, peered down into the well. Based on what I can see from here, these appear to be female remains. But there's something unusual about their condition. They don't look decomposed. That's impossible, one of the deputies muttered. If they've been down there in water. I'm aware of that, Deputy, Dr. Bennett replied sharply. I'm simply reporting what I can observe. We need to get them out to make a proper assessment. The recovery operation was complex and took several hours. A specialized team was called in from Louisville, equipped with the necessary tools and expertise to safely retrieve the remains without compromising potential evidence. By late afternoon, the first body was brought to the surface. The gathered officials fell silent as the remains were carefully placed on a tarp spread across the grass. It was the body of a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s. She was dressed in a high-necked white cotton nightgown, now stained a rusty brown in places. Her dark hair was long, reaching past her waist, and her skin, while pallid, showed none of the expected signs of prolonged immersion in water. Her features were delicate, almost porcelain-like, with high cheekbones and a slender nose. "My God," Sheriff Holbrook whispered, "she looks like she could be sleeping." The second body, retrieved shortly after, was remarkably similar. Another young woman, slightly smaller in stature, but with the same dark hair and delicate features. She too wore a white nightgown, and her body showed the same unusual state of preservation. The resemblance between the two was unmistakable. They were clearly sisters, perhaps even twins. "I've never seen anything like this in 30 years of practice," Dr. Bennett said, her clinical detachment momentarily forgotten. "They should be skeletonized, or at least in advanced stages of decomposition. Instead, they look like they've been dead for days, not what must be years or even decades." Lucas Whitaker stood at a distance, watching the proceedings with a growing sense of dread. These women had been in his family's well, the same well his grandmother had warned about in her journal. Who were they? How long had they been there? And most disturbing of all, why had they been preserved in such an unnatural way? As the bodies were being prepared for transport to the medical examiner's facility, one of the deputies made another discovery. Around each woman's neck was a thin silver chain, and hanging from each chain was a small pendant. The pendants were identical, a circular design etched with strange symbols that no one present could identify. "Bag those separately," Dr. Bennett instructed. "They might help with identification." Lucas returned to the farmhouse as twilight descended, the property now eerily quiet after the departure of the law enforcement officials and the remains. He had been instructed not to leave town, as there would be additional questions once preliminary findings were established. Alone in his grandmother's house, surrounded by faded photographs and antique furniture covered in sheets, Lucas felt a profound unease settle over him. He returned to his grandmother's journal, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for what had been discovered. The journal was old, its leather binding cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. Much of it contained mundane entries about daily life, observations about the weather, notes about visitors, but as Lucas continued reading, he found more references to the well. April 28th, 1954. "The dreams have returned. I see them as they were, standing by the well in their white dresses, their dark hair blowing in a wind I cannot feel. They beckon to me, but I will not go. Some doors should never be opened again." And later, June 17th, 1968. "It has been 56 years today. The town has forgotten as I knew they would, but the well remembers and so do I. I have sealed it as best I can, but I fear it will not be enough. They are patient. They have all the time in the world." The date struck Lucas, June 17th, the same date he had discovered the bodies. 56 years from 1968 would place some significant event in 1912, the year mentioned in the newspaper clippings about the cold case. As night fell completely, Lucas found himself drawn to the window that overlooked the backyard. In the distance, he could see the well, now surrounded by police tape that fluttered in the gentle summer breeze. For a moment, just the briefest of moments, he thought he saw two figures in white standing beside it, their long dark hair moving as if underwater. He blinked, and they were gone. The following morning, Lucas drove to the Millfield Public Library, determined to find answers. The library was small, but maintained an extensive archive of local history, including bound volumes of the Millfield Gazette dating back to the town's founding. The librarian, an elderly woman named Martha Jenkins, looked up from her desk as Lucas entered. "You're Eliza Whitaker's grandson," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," Lucas replied, somewhat taken aback. "I'm trying to learn more about my family's property, specifically anything related to unusual events that might have occurred there." Martha's expression remained neutral, but her eyes, sharp behind her wire-rimmed glasses, studied him carefully. "You found them, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "In the well." Lucas stared at her, stunned. "How did you know?" The elderly librarian sighed deeply and rose from her chair. "Follow me," she instructed, leading him to a door marked Special Collections. The room beyond was small, with metal shelving units containing boxes of archived materials. Martha went directly to a shelf in the back corner and retrieved a dusty cardboard box labeled Whitaker Blackwood, 1910 to 1920. "Your grandmother made me promise never to speak of this," Martha said, placing the box on a small table in the center of the room. "But I suppose now that they've been found, the truth will come out one way or another." Inside the box were folders containing newspaper clippings, letters, legal documents, and photographs. Martha pulled out a particular folder and opened it to reveal a yellowed newspaper from November 3rd, 1912. The headline read, "Blackwood Sisters Missing, Foul Play Suspected." Beneath the headline was a photograph of two young women standing side by side in white dresses, their dark hair styled identically, their expressions solemn. They were unmistakably the same women whose bodies had been recovered from the well. "Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood," Martha said, pointing to the photograph. 22 and 20 years old, respectively. They lived with their father, Reverend Josiah Blackwood, in the house that later became your family's property. They disappeared in October 1912 and were never found. Until now, it seems. Lucas studied the photograph, a chill running through him. "What happened to them?" Martha's lips thinned to a grim line. The official investigation concluded that they had run away, perhaps to escape their father, who was known to be a severe and controlling man. But there were rumors, dark rumors, that the town tried to forget. She pulled out another clipping, this one from a week later. The article described how Reverend Blackwood had been found dead in his study, an apparent suicide. He had left a note that simply read, "Forgive me, for I could not save them from themselves." "Save them from what?" Lucas asked. Martha hesitated, then extracted a small leather-bound book from the box, a diary with the initials E.B. embossed in gold on the cover. This belonged to Eleanor Blackwood. It was found hidden in the attic of the house years later, during renovations. "Your grandmother brought it to me for safekeeping. Perhaps it contains the answers you seek." Lucas took the diary with trembling hands. "Why would my grandmother keep all this secret?" "The Whitakers purchased the property in 1920, 8 years after the disappearance. Your great-grandfather, Thomas Whitaker, was a practical man who didn't believe in superstition. But your grandmother, she experienced things in that house that changed her perspective. She believed that speaking about the Blackwood sisters would somehow awaken something better left dormant." Lucas spent the rest of the day in the Special Collections room, reading Eleanor Blackwood's diary. The entries began in January 1912 and continued until October of the same year. The early entries described the mundane details of life in rural Kentucky, church socials, household chores, visits from neighbors. Eleanor wrote about her younger sister Catherine with obvious affection. though she often expressed concern about Catherine's melancholic disposition and unusual interests. As the months progressed, the entries became increasingly disturbing. Eleanor wrote about strange dreams that both she and Catherine were experiencing, dreams in which they were visited by a woman in black who spoke to them in a language like music, but with discordant notes that hurt the mind. In April, Eleanor described finding Catherine sleepwalking, standing by the well at midnight, staring into its depths. When awakened, Catherine had no memory of how she had gotten there, but told Eleanor that she had been called by the lady in the water. By July, Eleanor herself had begun to experience similar episodes. Her handwriting became less steady, her thoughts more fragmented. She wrote about symbols that appeared in her dreams, which she felt compelled to draw upon waking. The diary contained several pages of these drawings, circular designs with intricate patterns that made Lucas's eyes hurt when he tried to follow them. They were identical to the symbols on the pendants found around the sisters' necks. The final entry, dated October 28, 1912, read, "Father has discovered our midnight rituals. He found the altar we constructed in the root cellar, the symbols we carved into the wooden beams, the offerings we left. His rage was terrible to behold. He burned our books, our drawings, everything. He believes we have been corrupted, that we have invited something unholy into our home. He does not understand that it was already here, sleeping beneath this land long before any human set foot upon it. Catherine and I have made our decision. We have prepared the well as instructed. Tonight we will complete the binding. Our bodies will serve as the vessel, our souls as the lock and key. Father will try to stop us, but it is too late. The lady in black has promised us that we will not truly die, that we will dream in the water until we are needed again. I leave this record so that someone might understand. We do this not out of despair, but out of duty. The alternative is too horrifying to contemplate." Lucas closed the diary, his mind reeling. The implications were too fantastic, too terrifying to be real. And yet, the preserved bodies in the well seemed to defy natural explanation. When he returned to the farmhouse that evening, Sheriff Holbrook was waiting for him with news from the medical examiner. "Dr. Bennett has completed her preliminary examination," the sheriff said, his expression troubled. "She's determined that the cause of death for both women was drowning, but she's at a loss to explain their state of preservation. There's no evidence of embalming or chemical treatment. By all scientific standards, it's impossible. Have you identified them?" Lucas asked, already knowing the answer. "Two sisters named Blackwood, who went missing in 1912, Sheriff Holbrook confirmed. "We found records of the case in our archives. But here's the strange part. The medical examiner says that, based on the condition of the tissues, these women haven't been dead for over 100 years. She estimates the time of death at no more than 3 to 5 days ago." "That's impossible," Lucas whispered. "That's what Dr. Bennett said too," the sheriff replied grimly. "And yet, the evidence is right there on her examination table. 2 women, confirmed through dental records and facial recognition software to be Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood, who somehow died just days ago despite disappearing in 1912. He paused, then added, "There's something else. Those pendants they were wearing, the symbols match carvings we found on the interior of the well. They appear to have been cut into the stone a very long time ago." That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. The revelation that the Blackwood sisters had somehow died only days ago, despite having disappeared over a century earlier, defied all logic. He found himself drawn once again to his grandmother's journal, searching for any additional information that might shed light on the mystery. In the very back of the journal, in a section where several pages had been stuck together, Lucas discovered a letter addressed to the next keeper. The handwriting was his grandmother's, but it was shaky, written in her final years. "To whoever bears the burden after me, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found what sleeps in the well. I had hoped it would remain undisturbed for another generation, but perhaps that was too much to ask. What you must understand is that the Blackwood sisters did not act out of malice, but out of desperate necessity. The thing they imprisoned, the Lady in Black, as they called her in their naive understanding, is far older than our town, older perhaps than humanity itself. The indigenous people who lived on this land before the settlers arrived knew of it. They left warnings carved in stone, symbols of protection that the early missionaries mistook for pagan idolatry and destroyed. Without those protections, the thing in the deep places began to wake. The Blackwood sisters, sensitive to such influences, were the first to hear its call. What they did, binding themselves to the well, using their own bodies as a living seal, bought us time. Their sacrifice kept it dormant, dreaming, but such bindings weaken over time. Every 56 years, the stars align in a particular configuration, and the barrier between our world and the deep places thins. During these times, the binding must be renewed, or it will fail completely. I performed the ritual in 1968, as my mother taught me. It requires blood freely given, words spoken in the old language, and a willing heart. I have written the procedure in the book, hidden beneath the loose floorboard in the main bedroom, under the braided rug. If the bodies have been removed from the well, then the binding is already weakening. You will know by the dreams. They will come first, showing you what waits below. Then the physical manifestations will begin. You have a choice to make. You can flee, as many Whitakers have done before you, leaving the responsibility to fall to another. Or you can accept the burden that comes with our name and our land. I cannot tell you which path to choose. I can only tell you that if the binding fails completely, what emerges will not stop at our property line, our town, or even our state. It will spread like a stain across the land, a darkness that consumes all it touches. May God guide your decision. Eliza Whitaker. Lucas read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling more violently with each reading. It was madness, all of it. Talk of ancient entities, bindings, rituals. It couldn't be real. And yet, the preserved bodies of the Blackwood sisters defied scientific explanation, as did their apparent recent time of death, despite having disappeared over a century ago. He went to the main bedroom and found the braided rug his grandmother had mentioned. Beneath it, just as described, was a loose floorboard. And beneath the floorboard was a small iron box, locked with a key he didn't possess. But the box was old, the lock mechanism simple. Lucas found a letter opener in his grandmother's desk and managed to pry it open after several minutes of effort. Inside was a book, bound in what appeared to be dark leather, though the texture was strange, almost scaly to the touch. The pages were made of a material Lucas couldn't identify, not paper, not parchment, but something in between. The text was written in multiple hands, suggesting it had been passed down and added to over generations. Some sections were in languages Lucas didn't recognize, with alphabets that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. Other parts were in English, including detailed instructions for a ritual called the Renewal of Chains. The ritual, as described, required the blood of a Whitaker freely given at the edge of the well during the dark of the moon. Specific words had to be spoken, words that Lucas found difficult to pronounce even in his mind, and certain symbols drawn on the stones surrounding the well. The most disturbing element was the final requirement. The keeper must be willing to serve as anchor, bound to the property and the well for 56 years, until the next alignment allows for transition of the burden. Lucas closed the book, feeling physically ill. His grandmother had performed this ritual, had bound herself to this property for over 50 years. It seemed impossible, and yet it would explain why she had never left Millfield, why she had lived alone in this isolated farmhouse decade after decade. He was startled from his thoughts by the ringing of his phone. It was Sheriff Holbrook, his voice tight with tension. "Mr. Whitaker, we have a situation. The bodies of the Blackwood sisters are gone." "Gone?" Lucas repeated numbly. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean they've disappeared from the morgue," the sheriff replied. "The attending physician stepped out for less than 5 minutes, and when he returned, the examination room was empty. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone else entered the building. They're just gone." As if in response to this news, the lights in the farmhouse flickered, then went out completely, plunging Lucas into darkness. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling around the eaves of the old house like a living thing, and from the direction of the well came a sound that might have been the wind, might have been rushing water, or might have been something else entirely, a sound like distant, discordant singing. Lucas moved to the window and looked out toward the backyard. The crime scene tape still surrounded the well, fluttering violently in the wind. And standing beside it, clearly visible despite the darkness, were 2 figures in white nightgowns, their long dark hair moving as if underwater, even in the open air. They were looking directly at the house, directly at him, their faces expressionless, their eyes black pools that reflected no light. As Lucas watched, frozen in horror, the figures turned in unison and stepped into the well, disappearing from sight. The wind died immediately, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. The lights in the house came back on as suddenly as they had gone out. Lucas's phone rang again. It was Dr. Bennett, the medical examiner. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, without preamble, "I need to tell you something that I didn't share with the sheriff. Before the bodies disappeared, I found something unusual in their thoracic cavities. Both women had an object where their hearts should have been, a small stone figure, identical in both bodies. I've never seen anything like it in my career." "What did the figure look like?" Lucas asked, already dreading the answer. "A woman in flowing robes, but with a face that was wrong somehow, too angular with too many eyes. I took photographs for the record, but those files have been corrupted. The physical figures are also missing, along with the bodies." Lucas thanked her mechanically and ended the call. He returned to the book his grandmother had left, searching for any mention of stone figures or replaced hearts. He found it in a section titled "The First Binding," which described how the Blackwood sisters had removed their own hearts and replaced them with carved effigies of the Lady of the Deep, creating a physical link that would allow their bodies to serve as an effective seal. The book claimed that as long as the effigies remained within the sisters' bodies, and the bodies remained within the well, the binding would hold. But if either condition were broken, the binding would begin to fail, allowing what was imprisoned to gradually awaken. The bodies had been removed from the well, the effigies had been discovered and documented. And now both the bodies and the effigies were missing, presumably having returned to the well of their own accord, or been returned by whatever force they had been containing. Lucas understood now why his grandmother had been so insistent that no one disturb the well. She had known what was at stake. She had carried the burden of this knowledge alone for decades, performing the renewal ritual in 1968 and preparing for the next alignment in 2024. But she had died before she could complete her duty or properly prepare her successor. And now Lucas, who had never asked for this burden, who had planned to sell the property and return to his academic life, found himself facing a terrible choice. The next night of the new moon, when the ritual would need to be performed if he chose to accept this responsibility, was just 3 days away. June 21st, the summer solstice. Was it coincidence that this aligned with the star configuration mentioned in his grandmother's letter? Lucas doubted it. Nothing about this situation seemed coincidental. He spent the next day researching the Blackwood family and the history of the property, trying to find some rational explanation, some evidence that would disprove the fantastic narrative he had pieced together from his grandmother's writings and Eleanor Blackwood's diary. What he found instead were more connections, more evidence suggesting that the story, as unbelievable as it seemed, might actually be true. The land had been considered sacred by the Shawnee people who had originally inhabited the area. Early settlers had reported strange phenomena, unexplained lights, unusual sounds, livestock that went mad or died without apparent cause. Reverend Blackwood had purchased the property in 1900 despite warnings from locals, believing it was his divine mission to reclaim cursed ground for God. Local newspaper archives revealed a pattern of unusual events occurring in 56-year cycles. In 1856, a settler family named Hargrove had disappeared without trace from the property. In 1912, the Blackwood sisters had vanished. In 1968, 3 local teenagers who had broken into the then vacant property as a dare had been found wandering in the forest 3 days later with no memory of what had happened but with strange symbols carved into their palms, the same symbols that appeared on the pendants worn by the Blackwood sisters. And now it was 2023, 55 years since the last incident, 1 year before the next 56-year mark. Lucas wondered if his grandmother's death had somehow weakened whatever protections she had maintained on the property, allowing what was bound in the well to exert its influence early, drawing him back to Millfield just as the cycle was beginning again. On the evening of June 20th, Sheriff Holbrook visited the farmhouse with troubling news. "We've had 3 disappearances in the past 24 hours, he informed Lucas. "A teenage couple who were last seen walking near your property, and Dr. Bennett, the medical examiner." Lucas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Any leads?" "Nothing concrete," the sheriff admitted, "but there's something else. We found these." He produced an evidence bag containing 3 silver pendants, identical to those worn by the Blackwood sisters. "They were left on my desk this morning. No fingerprints, no surveillance footage showing who delivered them. Just these, along with a note." The note, which the sheriff showed Lucas, contained just 5 words. "The binding weakens. Choose quickly." After Sheriff Holbrook left, Lucas returned to the book his grandmother had hidden, studying the ritual instructions more carefully. The text was clear that only a blood descendant of those who had accepted the burden could perform the renewal. The Blackwood sisters had been the first, taking on the role that had previously been maintained by the indigenous people through different methods. After the Blackwoods came the Whitakers, beginning with Lucas's great-grandmother Harriet, who had experienced dreams and visions shortly after moving into the house, leading her to discover the hidden history of the property. If Lucas chose not to perform the ritual, the binding would continue to weaken until it failed completely at the 56-year mark in 2024. The consequences, as described in the book and in his grandmother's letter, would be catastrophic, not just for Millfield but potentially for a much larger area. But accepting the responsibility would mean binding himself to this property for the rest of his life, becoming the keeper of a secret that would isolate him from normal society, dedicating himself to maintaining a prison for something he didn't fully understand and couldn't truly comprehend. As night fell, Lucas found himself standing at the edge of the property, looking back at the old farmhouse silhouetted against the darkening sky. His car was packed. He could leave now, drive away, pretend none of this was real. Someone else would buy the property eventually. Perhaps they would discover the truth, perhaps not. Perhaps the whole thing was an elaborate hoax or a shared delusion passed down through generations of his family. But as he stood there, contemplating escape, he became aware of a presence behind him. Turning slowly, he found himself face to face with the Blackwood sisters. They stood side by side, their white nightgowns and dark hair moving gently as if underwater, their skin pale and luminescent in the twilight. Their eyes, which had been dark pools when he had seen them from a distance, now appeared normal, sad, tired, human eyes in young faces that had seen too much. "You are of the blood," Eleanor said, her voice strangely muffled, as if coming from a great distance. "The responsibility falls to you." "I never asked for this," Lucas replied, surprised that he was able to speak at all in their presence. "Neither did we," Catherine said softly. "Neither did your grandmother or her mother before her." But some burdens choose us, rather than being chosen. What is it? Lucas asked. What's down there in the deep places? The sisters exchanged a glance. We don't have words that can make you understand, Eleanor answered. Even we who have been joined with it for over a century cannot fully comprehend its nature. We know only that it sleeps, and must continue to sleep, for the sake of all that lives beneath the sun. If I refuse? Lucas asked. Then it will wake, Catherine said simply, first here, then spreading outward like ripples in a pond. Dreams will become nightmares. Thoughts will turn to madness and violence. The veil between worlds will tear, and what pours through will consume all it touches. And if I accept, what happens to you? We continue our vigil, Eleanor replied. We dream in the water, neither truly alive nor truly dead. We maintain the inner barrier, while the keeper maintains the outer. One cannot exist without the other. Lucas looked past them, toward the farmhouse that had been in his family for over a century, the land that had been considered sacred long before European settlers arrived. He thought about his grandmother, living alone in that house, decade after decade, carrying a burden no one else could see or understand. I need time to think, he said finally. The Blackwood sisters nodded in unison. Until tomorrow night, Eleanor said. The dark of the moon. After that, it will be too late. They turned and walked away, not toward the well, but into the forest that bordered the property, disappearing among the trees like mist. Lucas stood alone in the gathering darkness, the weight of decision heavy upon him. That night, Lucas dreamed of the well. In his dream, he descended into it, the water parting around him like a curtain, allowing him to sink deeper and deeper into impossible depths. At the bottom was not earth or stone, but a vast, dark space like an underground sea. And in that sea moved something enormous, something that defied description, a presence rather than a form, a consciousness so alien and vast that merely being in its proximity threatened to shatter his mind. He sensed its awareness turning toward him, felt its attention like a physical weight. It knew him. It had been waiting for him. And it was hungry after its long imprisonment, hungry for freedom, for sensation, for the world above and all who dwelled in it. Lucas woke with a scream caught in his throat, his body drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. The dream had not been a dream at all, but a vision, a glimpse of what waited below, of what would emerge if the binding failed. As dawn broke over the Kentucky hills, Lucas made his decision. He would not run, as he had initially intended. He would not abandon this responsibility to someone else, someone unprepared, someone who might not understand the consequences until it was too late. He spent the day preparing for the ritual, gathering the materials described in the book. White candles made from beeswax, a silver knife that had been in his grandmother's kitchen drawer, a bowl of pure water collected from the morning dew. He studied the words he would need to speak, practicing their strange syllables until they felt less alien on his tongue. As twilight approached, he received a call from Sheriff Holbrook. "Mr. Whitaker, we've found them. The missing teenagers and Dr. Bennett. They were discovered walking along Route 42, disoriented and confused. They have no memory of where they've been for the past 2 days, but—" He hesitated. "They all have the same symbol carved into their palms, the same one from those pendants." "Are they all right?" Lucas asked. "Physically, yes. Mentally, time will tell. Dr. Bennett keeps saying something about the lady in the water and how the sisters saved them. Does that mean anything to you?" Lucas chose his words carefully. "Sheriff, there's a lot about this situation that can't be explained in rational terms. I'm dealing with it as best I can. I'd advise keeping those 3 under observation for the next 24 hours, for their own safety." "You know something you're not telling me," Sheriff Holbrook said, his tone hardening. "Yes," Lucas admitted, "and if I tried to explain it, you'd think I was insane. Maybe I am, but if I'm right, this will all be over soon and things can go back to normal." "Normal," the sheriff repeated skeptically. "Mr. Whitaker, if you're involved in something dangerous or illegal—" "Nothing illegal," Lucas assured him. "Just old. Older than our laws. Older than our understanding. Please, trust me for 24 hours. After that, if you still have questions, I'll answer them as best I can." There was a long pause before Sheriff Holbrook responded. 24 hours, he agreed finally. "But I'll be watching." As night fell on June 21st, the dark of the moon, Lucas walked out to the well. The police tape had been removed days ago, though the investigation was technically still open. The stone structure stood silent and ancient in the deepening gloom, a portal to something Lucas now understood was far older and more dangerous than he had initially believed. He set up the candles as instructed in the book, placing them at specific points around the well to form a pattern that matched the symbol on the pendants. He filled the bowl with the dew water he had collected and placed it on the edge of the well. Then, taking a deep breath, he began to speak the words written in the book, words that felt ancient and powerful, words that seemed to hang in the air after he uttered them, creating patterns of sound that were almost visible in the candlelight. As the ritual progressed, the air around the well began to thicken and swirl, creating a gentle vortex that caused the candle flames to dance, but did not extinguish them. Lucas felt a pressure building, not just in the atmosphere, but within his own mind, a sense of being watched, evaluated, judged by something vast and incomprehensible. The final step was the blood offering. Lucas took the silver knife and without hesitation drew it across his palm. The pain was sharp but clean, and he watched as his blood dripped into the bowl of water, turning it crimson in the candlelight. He dipped his bleeding hand into the bowl, mixing his blood with the water, then sprinkled the mixture around the edge of the well, while speaking the final words of the ritual. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The vortex of air intensified, the candle flames stretched upward like pillars of fire, and from deep within the well came a sound, not quite a voice, not quite a song, but something between the two, something that vibrated in Lucas's bones and resonated with the blood in his veins. The Blackwood sisters appeared beside the well, no longer looking solid and real as they had the night before, but translucent, ghostly, their forms wavering like reflections in disturbed water. They reached out toward Lucas with pale hands, their expressions solemn but grateful. "The binding is renewed," Eleanor said, her voice more distant than before. "The keeper is acknowledged." "The price is accepted," Catherine added. "The cycle continues." Lucas felt something pass between them, an exchange of energy, of purpose, of responsibility. A weight settled upon him, not physical but spiritual, a connection to the land and to what dwelled beneath it that he knew would remain with him for the rest of his life. The sisters turned toward the well and, hand in hand, stepped over its edge. There was no splash, no sound of falling bodies hitting water. They simply disappeared, returning to their vigil in the depths. The vortex subsided, the candle flames returned to normal, and Lucas was left alone beside the well, his hand still bleeding, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. He had accepted the burden. He had bound himself to this place, to this duty. For 56 years, until 2079, he would be the keeper, the outer guardian who maintained the seal that kept the ancient entity imprisoned. In that moment, Lucas understood his grandmother in a way he never had before. He understood her isolation, her apparent eccentricity, her reluctance to leave the property or to allow others to explore it fully. She had carried this burden alone for decades, protecting a world that would never know what she had sacrificed for its safety. Now that burden was his. He would need to learn how to live with it, how to fulfill his responsibility, while finding what happiness and purpose he could within its constraints. Perhaps, unlike his grandmother, he would find a way to prepare his successor properly, to ensure that the knowledge and the duty were passed on with clarity rather than in fragments and hidden journals. As Lucas walked back to the farmhouse, he felt different, changed in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The world around him seemed more vibrant, more alive, but also more fragile, more precious. He had glimpsed what waited in the deep places, what lurked beyond the veil of ordinary reality. He had seen what would happen if that veil were torn, if the ancient hungers were unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. And he had chosen to stand against that darkness, to maintain the binding that had been established by the Blackwood sisters over a century ago, renewed by generations of his family, and now entrusted to him. In the days and weeks that followed, life in Millfield gradually returned to normal. The disappearances were explained away as a case of mass hysteria or shared delusion, triggered perhaps by the discovery of the preserved bodies in the well, bodies that were never recovered after their disappearance from the morgue, and eventually became another unsolved mystery in the county records. Sheriff Holbrook questioned Lucas again, as promised, but found no evidence of wrongdoing. The case of the Blackwood sisters was officially closed once more, filed away as a historical curiosity that had briefly resurfaced before sinking back into obscurity. Lucas did not sell the property as he had initially planned. Instead, he took a leave of absence from his university position and began renovating the old farmhouse, restoring it to its former glory while carefully maintaining certain elements. The protective symbols discreetly carved into door frames and window sills, the arrangements of plants in the garden that formed patterns invisible to those who didn't know to look for them, the small shrine in the root cellar where offerings were left on specific days marked in his grandmother's calendar. He became known in town as something of an eccentric, much like his grandmother before him. People whispered about the professor who talks to himself and that odd Whitaker place, but they also came to respect his knowledge of local history and his commitment to preserving the old ways and stories of the region. And if, on certain nights, particularly when the moon was dark or when storms rolled across the hills, people sometimes glimpsed two female figures in white walking near the old stone well behind the Whitaker house. Well, that was just another local legend, another ghost story to tell around campfires or to share with tourists passing through. Only Lucas knew the truth. Only he understood the significance of the well, the nature of its occupants, and the critical importance of the binding that kept something ancient and hungry imprisoned in the deep places beneath the Kentucky soil. Every morning and every evening, he walked to the well and spoke words of renewal and containment. Every night he dreamed of the Blackwood sisters, maintaining their eternal vigil in the watery depths. And sometimes, in those dreams, he caught glimpses of what they guarded against, the vastness that waited, the hunger that never ceased, the patient malevolence that tested the boundaries of its prison, constantly searching for weakness, for opportunity. But the binding held firm. The sisters kept their watch, and Lucas Whitaker, the newest keeper of an ancient burden, stood guard over a secret that the world would never know, protecting humanity from horrors it could not comprehend. As for what waits beneath the well, in the deep places where light has never reached, perhaps it's better not to know. Perhaps some secrets should remain buried, some doors should stay closed, some ancient hungers should never be awakened. But if you ever find yourself in the rolling hills of Kentucky near a small town called Millfield, and you see an old farmhouse on a gentle rise with a stone well in the backyard, keep your distance, don't linger after dark, and never ever drink the water.